everyone, and welcome to this year's final February series lecture. I can't believe it's the last one. I mean, it's amazing, and they have all been absolutely fantastic, and I know that tonight is not going to disappoint. It's going to be terrific. So we're glad you all are here. I am Melissa Wright, Chief Executive Officer of the Container Store. How many of you are familiar with the Container Store? Please raise your hands and have shopped in the store or online. We appreciate it. We really do. Thank you so much. And we have been the proud sponsors of this lecture series, what, Sandy, for over 10 years? 10 years, and you know, if you really think about it, it makes sense. You know, brain health, sharp mind, organized life, there's a definite connection and correlation there. That's not a stretch. It's really, really true. And we have just really enjoyed this. I don't know about you, but when I have a healthy brain and a clear mind and a sharp mind, I make better decisions, and I bet you do too. So we're just really happy to be partners with the center. And I do want to thank my friend and colleague Sandy Chapman and really everyone here at the center for being such incredible partners. They're just creative thinkers, and they've just been invaluable, and we really, really, really appreciate it. And you know, it's really nice to be able to be a part of doing all the incredible work that the center is doing here, and to be able to give back to the community and have access for the community to have access to the center. I think it's just wonderful. I also want to thank Janis and Roy Coffey for serving as the sponsors for this lecture. Thank you so much with Dr. Grant. Really appreciate that. Round of applause. And you know, I am really fascinated by tonight's topic. I really am. Anybody else? Yeah, you wouldn't be here, right? I think it's going to be amazing. I am absolutely going to take notes, and I think on your chair you'll find a little notepad and a pen, courtesy of the Container Store. So we hope you will use them and enjoy that and take some notes. So here to introduce Dr. Igor Grant is Dr. Francesca Philby, and I do have to read this, y'all. I really do. The Burt Moore Endowed Chair at the Center for Brain Health and School of Behavioral and Brain Sciences at the University of Texas at Dallas. So welcome, Dr. Philby, and if you'll do the introductions. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. It truly is my honor to introduce Dr. Igor Grant tonight. I have followed his work since I got into the field of cannabis research when I did about 20 years ago, 15 or 20 years ago, because it was very, very understudied at the time. And so when I met Dr. Grant about 5 years ago, he was our discussant for a seminar, a symposium that I organized for the American Psychological Association. It really opened my eyes to what we could be doing and what we still need to be doing. So I'm very pleased to have Dr. Grant speaking with us today. He is an incredible knowledge source for the history and evidence related to the therapeutic efficacy of cannabis. He is a distinguished professor and director of the HIV Neurobehavioral Research Program in the Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research at the University of California in San Diego. That last bit, the Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research, is really spectacular, quite spectacular. It's funded by the state of California, and it's one of its kind, one of the forefront leading centers dedicated to investigating the therapeutic effects of cannabis while minimizing the harm. Since 2000, Dr. Grant has been the director of the State of California Funded Center for Cannabis Research, as I mentioned, which is established to develop a knowledge base concerning cannabis, and is currently conducting a number of studies on both therapeutic potentials and potential risks for medicinal cannabis. He has contributed to approximately 800 scholarly publications. That's 800 papers he has written, which is a lot, and is principal investigator of several NIH studies. Please help me welcome our esteemed speaker, Dr. Igor Grant.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, Dr. Philby, for this very kind introduction. Thank you, Dr. Chapman, for your hosting us here. And I understand, is it Janis and Roy Coffee that have sponsored this? Thank you very much for doing that. And I'm looking forward to a dinner this evening that is sponsored by Julie and Jimmy Musselman, I believe. So thank you very much as well. It's always a little bit daunting when one gets a big build-up like you've given me, so I hope there won't be a disappointment at the end of my talk. I'm going to focus on one particular vantage point here, and that is what are the medicinal potentials of cannabis. There are many other topics we could discuss, such as the harms, social implications and things. I'm very happy to answer questions about that for those of you who would like to ask them about things I won't cover. But I cannot cover everything, but I'll try to do a good job in at least this topic. So, as you probably know, marijuana, or the cannabis sativa plant, contains many chemicals, and about 100 or more of those are classified as cannabinoids, which are chemicals that have a particular base structure. And by the way, just to clarify something, you will be reading about hemp. Hemp is cannabis sativa. It is simply a variant that doesn't have the enzyme, or it has not got turned on the enzyme to make THC. But otherwise, it's the same plant, so it's not some different species or anything like that. So, how did this advance here? Just a moment. I must have been hitting the computer. I apologize. Okay, so there are, as I say, many cannabinoids. And this field really began in the middle part of the 20th century with explorations by an Israeli scientist, Raphael Mechoulam, and his team. And he was the first to actually characterize the chemical structure of what is the psychoactive ingredient in marijuana, the principal psychoactive ingredient, which is tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC. He also discovered or characterized the structure of cannabidiol, CBD, which is of a lot of interest at the moment. This is not a new medicine, and this little picture shows that in October 1913, you could buy an Eli Lilly company product called Cannabis Americana. I want to emphasize it's Americana, it's not from some other place. And it was physiologically tested, American grown, analgesic, hypnotic, antispasmodic, and powerful narcotic. And it turns out that not all of this is wrong, that some of these claims, which were not at all established in those days, actually have proven to be at least partly true, as I'll describe. Now, as you probably know, there has been a huge change in the past 2 decades on public attitudes and the legal status of marijuana and the cannabinoids. Beginning in 1996, when California passed the first in the country medicinal marijuana law, we now have really the majority of the population living in states where there is some form of medicinal cannabis access. Now, it varies as to how permissive it is and what the rules are, but as you can see from combining the blue and the green, these are all places where there is at least some medicinal cannabis access. And then the green states are the ones that have actually legalized marijuana for recreational purposes. This is likely to continue for a while yet. Now, why the buzz, if you don't mind that? It's actually fun to lecture about medicinal cannabis. There's so many double and triple entendres that always come to mind. Clear away the smoke, what's the buzz? Okay. So why has this interest developed in the last couple of decades? And there are a couple of reasons. One I've already alluded to, and that is there's been a gradual view on the part of the general public that these are compounds that may have some medicinal uses. And this really, I think, stems partly to the onset of the AIDS epidemic. People with HIV/AIDS do get quite often a condition called painful peripheral neuropathy, which is a difficult to control kind of pain. By the way, there are other causes of peripheral neuropathy. AIDS just happens to be one of them. And it turns out that because people with HIV, at least some of the risk groups were also tended to be people who tried marijuana and so forth, they discovered that for some of them it was helpful. And so there was a lot of anecdotal evidence that started coming out. And also anecdotal evidence in the area of multiple sclerosis and severe spasms. So part of it was this anecdotal evidence. Part of it was that gradually neuroscience and medical science started discovering what was the basis of the action of these cannabinoids. So it turns out that we do have internal systems of signaling on our brain cells and other kinds of cells. There are receptors called CB receptors, cannabinoid receptors. And there's a couple of varieties of those. We know at least two, CB1 and CB2. And these receptors are the ones that receive THC and the cannabinoids. Now, you can say, well, why do we have these receptors? Certainly, God or nature didn't put them in there in order to accommodate the marijuana plant. There must be some other reason for it. And it turns out that, yes, there is a reason. There is an internal signaling system called the endocannabinoid system. And there are molecules that mimic some of the actions of THC. These things are called, two of them that are well known now are called anandamide and 2-arachidonyl-glycerol. If you can pronounce that with me, you get extra credit, 2AG for short. And then understanding how these things act has led to the development of a number of synthetic compounds, inhibitors and agonists and antagonists and partial agonists, all these kinds of things. So how do these things work? Well, some of you may know from reading your neuroscience or just reading popular science that chemical message, or the way messages pass from one nerve cell to another, or any other cell to another, is through release of chemical substances. In the case of the nervous system, they're called neurotransmitters, and they act on the next cell, the receiving cell, to change it in some way to propagate the signal. And so transmitters like dopamine, for example, which people might be familiar with from studying mood disorders or Parkinson's disease and so forth. Dopamine is an example of such a neurotransmitter. And there are many others. Glutamate is another one, which is kind of an excitatory transmitter. GABA is one that kind of is more of a downer, damps things down. Now, the endocannabinoid system is not, though, the same. It's not a classical go from point A to point B and propagate a signal. Instead, what it does is it regulates the functions of those original things. So it has what I would think of as kind of a circuit breaker or shock absorber function. So when, let's say, an excitatory signal it moves from one cell to another, it causes the release of these endocannabinoids, and they damp down the original effect. So it's this kind of thermostatic circuit breaker function. So it's important to understand that these tend not to have so much direct action as they modulate the action of other things, although they do have some direct actions as well. Now, I'd like to spend a moment talking just about the California experience. As Dr. Fibley mentioned, we have a center that's been established at UC San Diego. And the story of that was that in 1996, as I mentioned, California passed its medical marijuana law. And it was very interesting that a couple of years after that, a number of legislators, and one of them was the late Senator John Vasconcellos, came to the university and said, you know, he was very supportive of medical marijuana, by the way, and he thought marijuana should be legalized and so forth. But the smart thing that I thought he did, and his colleagues did, he said, you know, in order for us to ever hope to advance our agenda, if it's ever going to be advanced, is to have evidence that these things actually work and what are their problems and so forth. And so they sponsored the establishment of a Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research at UC San Diego. It's a long story about how I got involved. I can talk about that another time. So, so we were established in 2000, and our purpose was then to conduct some early studies on medicinal cannabis. Let's see, let's just move on to this one. Now, you would think, well, conducting some studies, it's that difficult. It is actually very complicated, given what it is. And actually, I used to have an even more dizzying set of blocks and arrows to show you the regulatory channels you have to navigate to even acquire cannabis for medical research. And it turns out the only legal source at the time, well, it's still true actually for THC-containing product, is the federal government itself. It has a contract at the University of Mississippi. Ole Miss grows a lot of pot to support. I won't comment about that any further, but in case there are some Ole Miss alums here. But at any event, so they produce marijuana under contract that can be then distributed to medical researchers such as us to do studies. But in order for them to distribute it, you have to go through a number of reviews that you're doing research that's legitimate. The FDA has to provide a so-called IND, an investigational new drug certificate. The DEA is always very interested in these studies, and I learned a lot about the DEA process when we first got started. One has to get approval from the Drug Enforcement Administration in Washington, and then approval locally in San Diego. And the San Diego inspectors came out. I always like to tell this little story. One of our studies was going to be done in a so-called outpatient clinical research center. Well, at the University of California, San Diego at the time, that was a gigantic trailer, okay, that was, because we still hadn't had a building built for that purpose. And so the inspector came and said, well, where are you going to store this marijuana? We said, well, it's going to be in a safe like this. I said, well, yeah, but what's the safe attached to? It's attached to the trailer. But what is the trailer attached to? I mean, this was not a trailer like, you know, a little home trailer. It was this gigantic thing. So you get into very interesting discussions about, you know, whether there could be theft of these materials or some kind of distribution that's inappropriate and so forth. But anyway, once you get through, oh, and also, of course, probably Texas has this too. There's also a research advisory panel that's called RAPC there in California, which also has to opine on any narcotic drug type of research. So there are all these things that have to come together to get a study started, and it takes typically a year to actually get all of these approvals from the time you submit. So that's something you just need to know, and you may wonder why hasn't there been more research? It's because it's tough. Our study locations included a number of places in California. Although we're in San Diego, we funded some projects in other places as well. And here's an example of the kind of study that was done. So what you're seeing here is a study that was done actually at UC San Francisco. And it had to do with this neuropathic pain I mentioned before, which is a burning hypersensitivity type of pain. It's different than the pain of if you hit yourself with a hammer or have a broken bone. Those kinds of pains are actually addressed very well with opioids or even non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, Advil type of drugs. But neuropathic pain tends not to be so responsive to those agents. And it does respond to some other things, certain kinds of antidepressants, not, by the way, because it works on depression. There's another mechanism there, and certain kinds of anti-epileptic drugs, but not everybody gets help. So because of that anecdotal evidence I talked about before, there was some interest in trying a THC-containing preparation. So what Dr. Abrams did was he recruited a number of patients with HIV/AIDS who had this neuropathic pain. He evaluated them beforehand, that's in that first panel. Then he brought them into the hospital, into a secure unit, where they got some more evaluation, and then they got randomized, that is assigned to, Group A or Group B, and Group A got, for example, active THC-containing marijuana. Group B got inactive THC, non-containing marijuana. It's like decaf coffee, if you will. It tasted the same, and it made you cough, but didn't give you the high. Then there was the evaluation period, and what you can see is that compared to the placebo marijuana, which is the yellow bars, there was more reduction in pain. Going down is good on this chart, so the lower you go, the less pain you're experiencing. And so you can see that the red group, which got the active treatment, actually responded much better. There was a placebo effect, by the way, in the yellow group as well. So that's always a very important thing, that there's placebo can also be helpful. And then once they stopped, there was a continuation of benefit for a number of days. So this is an example of the type of study that was done. There were a number of studies with the painful neuropathy. There was also a study with multiple sclerosis, spasticity, but they had this general kind of model. So in this particular chart, I don't know if can you people see at the back anything in this thing? Okay. Basically, it summarizes the first 7 studies that we completed, and you can see most of them had to do with pain. One of them had to do with MS spasticity, and the pain mostly was HIV-related pain, although there was one study with diabetic neuropathy. And what you can see is there were small groups, these were small studies, and then it says what was the content of THC in these different preparations, and then what was the result. Plus is that it worked, and minus it didn't. You can see all of them worked in the short term, which actually was a surprise to me, because I thought, well, we're going to get into this. First of all, thank you for the money. We'll do the research, but then at the end of the day, we probably would say, oh, it worked sometimes, other times it didn't, and we'll still be scratching our heads. It didn't happen that way. Every study showed benefit in the short term. Doesn't mean it's magic, but in these cases, it was helpful. And then we have some ongoing studies that have received funding from different sources, some of which are National Institute of Health, some are foundation funds. And you can see they concern conditions like low back pain. There's an interesting study going to start with kids with severe autism. There's some evidence, I shouldn't say evidence, there's some anecdotal evidence that cannabidiol or CBD may be helpful in certain of the symptoms of autism. And then there are other neurological studies of essential tremor. This is a kind of shaking that particularly older people can get. We're going to be doing a study in psychosis, which is schizophrenia symptoms. A little bit of evidence that CBD might be helpful there. And then there are some sensory neuropathy studies, and also a study on potential problems, which is a large study one of my colleagues is conducting on driving. And here what he does is he brings people into the lab. We have set up a special smoking room or vaporization room with negative pressure. That means all the stuff is vacuumed out of there, so it doesn't, but I always joke, how many students are on the roof of our building? Exhaust fan. Anyway, so there is a special facility where people can take in the cannabis, and then they go to a driving simulator, and they're studied over time as to what's the effect on their driving skills. There are blood tests, and also he's testing other ways of detecting cannabis that might be useful at the roadside. For example, blood tests are cumbersome. They take time to get to a lab and so forth. Can you use breath like you use with alcohol? Can you use saliva testing? So they're looking at all that. And also, can you test at the roadside using tests that, approaches that may be different than alcohol? Because even though our best understood model of impairment in driving is with alcohol, the effects of marijuana are actually different. and not all of the things that are sensitive to alcohol effects are sensitive to marijuana effects. And I can talk about the details of that if anybody wants. So these are the kinds of studies that are now going, and then because we are funded by the state, one of the things we're doing is also distributing funds to investigators, and here are some studies that we'll be starting, particularly in rheumatoid arthritis, which is another inflammatory condition. It's a study that will be done at UCLA. Study on sleep disorders. Lots of people have sleep problems, particularly as they get older, and that's one of the big reasons people go to their dispensaries if they have them to get their CBD or even THC. And then an interesting new study on anorexia nervosa. You may know that anorexia nervosa is a severe eating disorder, affects primarily younger women, where they literally exercise and can exercise and starve themselves to death. And we all have terrific treatments, but there's some evidence that this endocannabinoid system and modulating it might be helpful in this regard. So that's the reason for that study. And then we have a basic science study on alcoholic rats. And so rats learn to become really interested in alcohol. And then they, what the point of this study is that in alcoholism, the problem is not to have people stop drinking initially. The problem is the relapse and the craving that happens that one cannot maintain sobriety for the long term. That, by the way, is true for eating problems as well. Everybody can lose weight, but how long? And so there's a little bit of evidence that cannabidiol may actually affect the mechanisms of craving, that relapse. And so we'll see how that works. If the alcoholic rats get better, then we'll try it on people. Okay, well, to the extent that these things work, how good are they anyway? There are a number of ways to evaluate them, but one metric is called number needed to treat. And basically, you don't need to study this slide, but I'll just show you that the lower the number is, the more effective the treatment is. And so in the case of neuropathic pain, as I mentioned, there's some antidepressants, particularly very old line antidepressants that used to be known as Elavil, Tofranil, these kinds of drugs. Actually very good. And then a lot of patients receive gabapentin or lamotrigine. And you can see that cannabis kind of fits in the middle there somewhere. It's not as good as the tricyclics, but it's not as bad as, for example, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which are the fluoxetine Prozac types of antidepressants. So it works moderately. How long the effect lasts is something that we don't know yet. The other question that's really interesting, the question of dosage. What these two charts show, on the left-hand side is a study that my colleague Dr. Barth Wilsey from UC Davis did, and he was looking again at this problem of neuropathic pain. And again, when the curves go down, that means your pain is better. And what he showed was that compared to placebo, which is the dotted line at the top, both very low concentration THC, he has 1.29%, I think it's 1.3%, something like that, and 3.5% THC containing marijuana was helpful in these patients. Now, no self-respecting recreational user would put up with 1.5% and 3% THC. I mean, that's just, that would be like drinking a non-alcoholic beverage almost, or a very, very low alcohol content beverage. And so what this raises is the possibility that actually some of the therapeutic effects, such as on pain, may occur at a much lower dose than the psychoactive high-producing effects. So there may be a dissociation. It doesn't may mean that you don't have to just hammer people with a bunch of THC and so their heads are spinning, but you can get the benefit at a much lower dosage. And we have other models for this. And for example, in depression treatment, in the treatment of pain with antidepressants, we know that we can give rather low doses of antidepressants to help with the pain, but at a dose that does not correct the depression necessarily. So there are a number of interesting ideas here. So what's kind of the summary of the current knowledge? There was a very important report that came out from the National Academies, and they did an exhaustive review of this field. There's books like this thick of all the studies that they were able to find. And their conclusion was that there is pretty good evidence, they call it substantial conclusive, that cannabinoids are actually helpful in neuropathic pain, this MS spasticity, and also control of nausea. And we've known that for a long time because there's a drug marketed as Marinol, which is basically THC, that is actually approved for the treatment of nausea. So, I don't know, what am I doing here that keeps... I think I must be touching this too hard or something. The other areas that the National Academies thought there was some evidence for is improving sleep, particularly those with chronic medical conditions and possibly with pain as a factor. And then they said, well, and there's certainly a little bit of evidence about anxiety disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder, promoting appetite and weight gain. I actually personally would move the appetite and weight gain up, because I noticed that a lot of people here were doing the pre-munchies. It's really true that cannabis stimulates people to eat. So that is a potential therapeutic use as well for people who have problems with eating, and particularly people with chronic, severe medical conditions that are complicated by nausea and so forth. The cannabinoids could be a place that could be helpful. And then they said there's no or insufficient evidence for treatment of certain other things, but one thing that needs to be updated is the epilepsy story, because in fact, as you probably know, cannabidiol, which is now marketed by GW Pharmaceuticals as something called Epidiolex, has been shown to be useful in the control of certain intractable seizures in kids. Well, the other interesting kind of theme that's been evolving, and I think is still not totally clear in my mind, is whether actually cannabis can reduce the need for opioids in people who are being prescribed opioids for severe pain. And there is some evidence that that's true, including animal models, that if you give THC-containing products, animals require less opioid and are less interested in opioid, and there's a little bit of clinical evidence that that may be true. And the other kind of evidence has to do with these epidemiologic and retrospective looks about what's happened to opioid use, prescriptions, and admissions to emergency rooms in places where medical marijuana laws came into effect. And it turns out that generally speaking, there are fewer of those opioid-related bad things that are going on in jurisdictions where there are medical marijuana laws. Now, whether that's a cause and an effect, or there's something unusual about the populations of the states that have legalized marijuana, these are all things that have to be sorted out, but it's a clue. So then, okay, so maybe smoked marijuana or inhaled marijuana is effective for certain things, but is it a viable medicine? And there are problems. You probably are not going to have somebody smoke a joint in a hospital, for example, where there are oxygen tanks and things like that, or where there might be a problem with secondhand smoke and so forth. And then some people don't like to smoke. I mean, are we going to teach them to smoke? So one needs to look at alternative delivery systems is the point. And one of those alternative delivery systems, obviously, is to take it by mouth. Well, there are a number of things that are complexities here as well. Again, in the left-hand two charts, you can see the level of THC in the blood. That's that blue or blue-green line. After you smoke or inhale, you can see very rapid increase in THC content. and then within an hour or so it dissipates, it gets redistributed to various tissues. Whereas if you take it by mouth, there's a much slower uptake and the level is lower. There are also other products that are produced, some of which are psychoactive. So it's not the same. Inhaling marijuana or cannabis allows more auto-titration, if you will. I mean, you get the feeling quick, and then you can control your intake, basically. When you take it by mouth, if you don't have an initial effect, you might be tempted to take more, and then a few hours later you really feel it. And so there's that kind of issue. So that still has to be worked out. There are devices for marijuana vaporization, of course. You've read a lot about this, and also about vaping-related injuries to the lungs. Some of these, or many of these, seem to come from devices that are kind of, who knows where they came from and what the content is, but usually it's both nicotine and marijuana that seems to be involved in these injuries. So there are many devices. I'm not going to dwell on the lung pathology here. Needless to say, some people get very severe lung injury from vaping. The particular vaporization method we use is called the volcano, affectionately. And basically what it is a device to heat the marijuana to a sub-combustion temperature. So it doesn't produce smoke, but it produces the vapors. And then obviously you inhale it and absorb it. And again, what this particular slide shows, again from Dr. Wilsey, is that just like with smoked marijuana, the vaporized product is effective in the control, short-term control of pain, and you do get a blood level of THC. So there's another approach that's been used by GW Pharmaceuticals. It's called Sativex, and that actually it's kind of like a breath freshener device, if you will. It's a pump delivery system into your mouth of a combination of THC and CBD. And there's been pretty good evidence that this particular delivery system also works in control of pain, similarly to the vaporized product. So this is a possible approach. Now our time is moving along, so I want to spend a little bit of time on CBD, because I know this is an area of interest. CBD is structurally not dissimilar from THC, but its actions are quite different. First of all, it does not work, at least in any appreciable way, on this endocannabinoid system that I described. It does not work on the CB1 and CB2 receptors. It works in some other kinds of mechanisms. But it does seem to have a number of effects, which may include anti-inflammatory effects. It may be an antiemetic, although there's some also data that it actually can make you nauseous, so that's an unclear area. It could be a hypnotic and a sedative, but there are better evidences that it's an anticonvulsive, that it may address anxiety, and it might be an antipsychotic as well. And I think I mentioned anti-epilepsy. And here's the anti-epilepsy study that I described before. This was a study that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, and it involved children with these severe epilepsies called Dravet and Lennox-Gastaut epilepsies. These kids have repeated seizures. They're not controllable by ordinary means, sometimes at least. And it turns out that CBD containing product, which they call Epidiolex, did reduce, which is what the blue bars show, the number of seizures compared to placebo. Now these were kids receiving other drugs as well. They couldn't dare take them off of things. So the question here that many people are asking, well, is it the CBD that was anti-epileptic, or did the CBD change the concentration of the other epileptic drugs, anti-epileptic drugs, or somehow modify their behavior. And so that's still an open question. I personally think the CBD itself is an anticonvulsant because there's some animal data to support that idea. Now, another area that's interesting is anxiety, and this is a little study that I'd like to describe for a moment. This was done in Brazil, and it brought a bunch of people in who had public speaking anxiety. And basically the idea was, you come in, you get a baseline evaluation, then you are forced to do a public speaking thing on television. Well, it's called circuit TV, but anyway, people with public speaking anxiety still have lots of anxiety doing that. And then people were randomized to receive CBD or placebo, and they were compared to the performance of people who did not have public speaking anxiety. So that's the blue people, or whatever that color is at the bottom. So people who don't have public speaking anxiety did fine doing this little TV thing. People with public speaking anxiety got really anxious, but the ones who got CBD, who are the ones in the middle, had less anxiety. And in fact, on the other chart, what it shows is that they had fewer negative self-statements. They weren't saying, oh, what a loser I am, and this is terrible, and so forth. So that kind of thing was much less in the CBD treated group. So this is an example of some evidence that CBD may be helpful in the treatment of anxiety, possibly also post-traumatic stress disorder. We'll have to see. And the other data one I want to show you is about schizophrenia. Now, it seems very unimaginable. We always hear about cannabis, causes psychosis, does it increase schizophrenia, and so forth. But CBD is a not particularly psychoactive substance. I shouldn't call it non-psychoactive, because if it helps with anxiety, obviously it has a psychoactive effect, but it's not a psychoactive drug in the same sense as THC. And what this shows is that this was a study done in Europe, and if you just concentrate on the two left-hand panels there, the patients received either an antipsychotic drug, a regular antipsychotic drug, or CBD. And then on the kind of y-axis is how symptomatic were they. And you can classify the symptoms of schizophrenia as positive and negative. Positive being hallucinations, disruptive behavior. Negative means withdrawn, not wanting to do anything. And what was very interesting is that in the CBD treated group, which is blue, on panel C there, the negative symptoms were better improved with the CBD than with the regular antipsychotic drug. Overall, both of them worked to some degree, but the CBD seemed to have a particular effect on the negative symptoms, which would be very interesting if that was true. All right, and here back to, we had drunken rats, now we have rats who are smoking a lot, nicotine that is. And another study that's ongoing is looking at the possibility that nicotine withdrawal also could be attenuated by CBD. So that would be very interesting, because smoking and keeping people from smoking is still a serious issue. And the treatments we have, some of them do have side effects of various kinds. So if we had an alternative, that would be great. Okay, so that's the smoking rats, and the drunken rats. Okay, now I wanted to actually just move to a summary because I want to be sure we have time for questions, right? Are we out of time? Just about close? No? We're still good? Well, can you take another slide? Okay, CBD. I mentioned, it's your fault, I offered to quit. I mentioned that CBD does not have the typical actions of THC through the cannabinoid receptors, but it does seem to work on other systems, and the details here are not so important, but it seems to work on systems that may have to do with excitability of the nervous system, and that might explain the epilepsy control. It seems to block some pathways related to inflammation, and so maybe that is how it's helpful in rheumatic conditions and conditions of that nature. And it also could enhance the action of another receptor that facilitates the work of serotonin, which is a neurotransmitter involved in anxiety. So it's possible that CBD has some value in these areas, and that there may be some mechanisms to explain how it is working. Okay, so how do we move forward in this? I've already alluded that in most countries it's not very easy. Actually, it's easier in Canada, because they've legalized marijuana, and there's a whole regime for supporting research into these topics there. I shouldn't be bragging about Canada as a former Canadian, but just in full disclosure, I was Canadian, so they're nice people. Anyway, how do we move forward seriously? One thing I would hope we could do, and here's where folks like yourselves can be helpful, is can we just please separate out the discussion on medical uses from recreational? These are different things. Society obviously wants to be able to regulate unintended uses of anything. And that's fine, there could be lots of discussions about that. But on the medical side, we should really be concentrating on developing evidence for and against, just like we do with any kind of medication. So that would be, if the dialogue could be moved in that direction, that would be good. And there's some evidence that in Congress, actually, I think there is some bipartisan support for this kind of view that, let's talk about the science, and let's not talk about legalization necessarily as part and parcel of that. And that would then lead to larger proof of principle studies and formal studies to see whether these things really work. I said I think that there's pretty good evidence, for example, THC-containing products help with neuropathic pain. But the studies have been done in very specific populations. In our case, HIV people who were in their mid-40s, 50s, that kind of thing. What if you're a person with diabetes and you're 80 years old? Is it going to have the same benefit, or will the toxicities be different because of different metabolism in older people? So these are things that need to be examined much more carefully. The rescheduling of cannabis would be helpful. For those of you not familiar with the schedule, basically there's a tiered system of classifying potentially addicting drugs from the most addicting and dangerous and / useless, which is Schedule 1, down to Schedule 5, which are things that could have some abuse potential, but really are kind of pretty mild. So marijuana sits in Schedule 1, together with heroin, LSD, and phencyclidine, I think, and various things like this. And this is really isn't supported by the science anymore. Yes, marijuana can be habit forming. There's no question about that. But is it heroin? Is it, these kinds of drugs? So it should be moved to a different schedule. We have opioids that are in lower schedule. Codeine, for example, it's used a lot. It's in Schedule 2 if it's a high dose, and it's Schedule 3 if it's a low dose. That makes a lot more sense if that were to happen. And then one needs to deschedule CBD. Now that has actually happened. CBD, if it's derived from either hemp, which in this case is defined as a plant that produces less than 0.3% THC, it is completely free of this schedule. Or if CBD is manufactured in a laboratory and you can show it has no THC in it, also it's not scheduled. So that hurdle has been jumped. But for medical research to advance, one still needs to then work with FDA regulators who have to look at how is this thing manufactured? Did they use good manufacturing practices? What was the whole, chain of manufacturing? Is it pure? Can you attest to it? Is it absorbed? And so on and so forth. So just because CBD has been descheduled doesn't make it necessarily easier to study. It will be easier, but there's still hurdles. And this is the example of the scheduling system. As you can see, it makes a great deal of sense because THC, which you see over there, if it comes from the plant, it's Schedule 1, so it's like heroin. If it's a synthetic, it's in Schedule 2. And if it's another kind of synthetic, it's Schedule 3. So we have THC, the same molecule, in 3 different schedules, and that doesn't make a lot of sense. So all of this has to be corrected. So I've talked about conducting controlled studies. Okay, so clearing the smoke. I think good examples of future research directions would be studies to address something I said before. How does patient diversity affect the outcomes? Older people, younger people, men, women, children, these are all open questions. Differential effectiveness and delivery systems. So can we in fact bypass vaporization, use oral forms, other kinds of forms? If just putting it on your skin over a painful joint, does it actually get absorbed? Does it work? We don't have the studies on that. It's very important. Studies on specific cannabinoids. There are things called minor cannabinoids that are just beginning to be researched, that are part of the marijuana repertoire, and maybe they are helpful also. Studies on synergistic or sparing effects, I mentioned before. If it's the case that the cannabinoids can reduce the need for opioids, which are much more potentially harmful and certainly more lethal in overdose, then that's another useful thing. And then studies on dosing, which I mentioned before. It could be that very low doses, particularly of THC-containing product, may be helpful and not produce a lot of the undesirable effects. Okay, I've covered a lot of ground, and I'd like to acknowledge all of the people in our center. There's a huge list of them. This is not something one does by oneself, obviously. And I'd again like to thank the sponsors here, and particularly the BrainHealth Institute for giving me an opportunity to talk to you, and I'd be happy to answer questions.
Wow, gave us so much food for thought. Thank you, Dr. Grant. And we do have time. This is a topic that is very hot. It's important in our community, and I appreciate some of the distinctions. I mean, Dr. Philby, as you said, he would give us such a weighed idea that can help us be much more logical in our discussions. Thank you for that. So raise your hand and we will. Yeah, he's passing it right now. So over here.
Hello? Okay. I have several questions. Back in February 2018, I went to a psychopharmaceutical convention in Las Vegas, and Kevin Hill gave 2 different lectures about the pros and cons of marijuana and cannabinoids, and he said that there were 106 of them that overall, and only 2 of them had been studied, and he discussed at length about the political reasons for why, they hadn't been studied further, that every time that somebody tried to study them, that the other side would bring up, reasons, and it just became a political nightmare. And so I was just wondering why we're still at the point where we don't seem to be at the point where people can, rock the boat with their political beliefs to try to understand this more, because there are so many cannabinoids that could possibly be very helpful, and yet we only studied 2 of them.
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of parts to your comment. One is that there are more than 100 probably cannabinoids, and the number grows over time. And some of them are available in only very trace amounts in the plant, so it's hard to know whether they have any action at all, at least in that native context. Maybe if you extracted them, you could. And I think that as we create a more rational scheduling system, it'll be easier to study these things because they are still in the group of molecules that are under Schedule 1, and so that makes it difficult. And also because they're more rare, it's more expensive to study them, and I don't think there's a lot of incentive sometimes, particularly for industry, to get into something if they think they're going to, just be completely weighed down with regulatory things that they can't ever bring it to actual distribution. The other is, as I said before, if we could separate out the concerns about harmful effects of marijuana as a recreational drug from the possible benefits and side effects as a medicinal, I think that would be very helpful. And I think we're moving in that direction. But there will be more research on these so-called minor cannabinoids, for sure.
I have a question from the other room.
The other room?
Yes, we have another room watching you.
Is that where the Russians are?
They are.
My name is Igor, by the way.
Have there been studies analyzing the interaction between marijuana use and antidepressants, ADHD drugs, etc.?
The short answer is no. There have been just the beginnings of some research. I think the places where the research has gone on drug-drug interactions has been more in the area of the epilepsy drugs, like I mentioned. There's more understanding now with CBD and what its effects may be on the traditional anti-epileptics. And the other is the area of opioids. And it's pretty clear from a very good amount of animal research and a little bit of human research that the cannabinoids may have so-called opioid-sparing effects. But I am not aware, maybe other people, are you aware of any work on antidepressants? And so we just don't know. But it's an important question also because CBD, which doesn't seem to have a lot of bad side effects, actually in high doses can affect liver function, and that's something that was noted in the kids' epilepsy study. So it's possible that if people start taking a lot of CBD, that could affect levels of other medications they're taking either up or down. But it hasn't been systematically looked at, unfortunately.
Thank you, Dr. Grant. Listen, here in Texas, we're concerned with, we have a 0.3 of 1% ceiling for THC, and I wondered if you might have a word about CBD that's suspended in a delivery such as chia seed oil, olive oil, black seed oil, pomegranate seed oil. Would you have a word on that, please?
Well, if by asking me to give some thoughts to it, you mean, do they work? Are they absorbed? Have they been studied kind of from a medical perspective? I have to say no. If you're asking, is it plausible that these delivery systems could deliver CBD in a way that's therapeutic? I think it is plausible, but I think we have to look at that. And as you point out, whatever the source of the CBD is, if it's from a plant, current federal law would restrict it if it had more than 0.3% THC in it.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Question. Itch is considered to be a sensation of a sub-pain threshold. Do you know of any studies being done of CBD or THC on the itch sensation? Second question is anybody trying a CBD suppository?
Well, first of all, on the itch thing, I am not aware of that, but it's a good question because, as you know, that is often the preceding part to having a painful sensation. Some of the same receptors and pathways are involved. So that would be a good question. And it certainly, there would be dermatologic, for example, benefits for people who have pruritus, severe itching from various kinds of eczematous conditions and so forth, which can really drive people crazy. And often there isn't a very good remedy. So that's an area that should be studied, but that's all I can say about that, I'm afraid.
Question here. Are you getting collaboration or hindrance from pharmaceutical companies in these studies?
It's a mixed bag. I think that companies and that have approved drugs in this area are not particularly enthusiastic about, for example, comparing their product with some product that you get from the University of Mississippi, which we can get essentially for free, and which the findings from which would then translate into stuff you can grow in your backyard or buy at a dispensary. So I think there are some disincentives on the part of pharma to support some of these kinds of studies. But I think the other hindrance here is that I think for some companies it's hard to say, well, if this is just a natural product and anybody can get it, why should I invest all this money to get it approved through the FDA and go through all these things. So I think there are a couple of disincentives. Having said that, I think the hemp bill, or the farm bill, which has legalized or led to legalization of CBD, not legalization, but descheduling, if we could get the FDA also to fast track how to study CBD from these different sources, that might create another supply chain. But at the moment, there's some problems with that. I'm not sure if I answered your question fully, but yeah.
Hi, question over here, Dr. Grant.
Oh, yes.
Yes, I'm a functional medicine doctor, and a lot of the controversy in that world is in regard to the concentration of CBD versus THC and its effectiveness. The second question would be the impact of CBD and cannabinoids on the immune system. You spoke a lot in regard to the neurotransmitter system, and I'm just interested in the evidence on impact on the actual immune system and its interplay with neurotransmitters.
Yeah, so it turns out that both THC and CBD have immunomodulatory effects, though they work through different mechanisms. And so, for example, THC-containing products can affect the functioning of the second receptor type, which is called the CB2 receptor, which seems to be more important in immune regulation. There have been studies, for example, animal studies, that show that inflammatory bowel changes, which can be induced in animals through various techniques, can be regulated by administration of THC, which in itself seems to be working through this CB2 receptor system. So that's point number one. CBD, cannabidiol, as I said before, does not work through these pathways. It has a different kind of pathway. And that still needs to be really understood better. I think we just don't know how CBD works, but it does clearly have some anti-inflammatory actions, both based on animal studies and some human observation.
Dr. Grant, the Farm Bill,
Yes.
over here.
Yeah.
The Farm Bill was brought to us by a senator from a tobacco state. It was rallied by the tobacco industry.
Actually, I had a picture of him in one of my slides, but I didn't.
Rallied by the tobacco industry. You mentioned these classifications of drugs. Nicotine is more addictive. It's been known for years. Nicotine is much more addictive than heroin or cocaine. Yet it is not a class drug. So the biggest impediment is two things. The biggest impediment is probably the tobacco industry, who will eventually get into the CBD business big time. The other is our legislators, who are ignorant of the need for the research and are motivated, led by companies in the pharmaceutical and tobacco industry. So what can we really do? You want to do research. We want you to do that research. What can we do to help our legislators learn to open the gates to research?
Yeah, and I think, thank you, that's a very important question, because I think that's what it's going to take is voters, constituents, to work with their legislators, be it in the House or the Senate. I'm talking about the federal level at the moment. To provide better education, to try to, as I say, separate out this dialogue of, is it just bad for society versus, could there be some medical benefits? I have to say, I feel some sense of encouragement. Now, maybe I'm delusional in this regard, but our group has been asked several times to brief legislative staff on the Hill, and we've met with some of the legislators themselves. And I have been impressed that whether they're Republican or Democrat, this is an issue where people can kind of get their head together and say, you know, if there is a medical benefit, if it could help people, veterans who suffer from severe PTSD and so forth, then let's do it. And there have been a number of bills that have been moved forward to some degree. They haven't all actualized, including in the VA, for example, I actually went to the House Veterans Affairs Committee where they questioned us about, you know, could it be helpful to PTSD? Should the VA be doing research in this area? Should VA doctors be allowed to at least say, hey, you know, I can't prescribe it, but you might want to try this. And right now, VA doctors can't do that. So I think there is some progress, but I think to get back to your point, I think what we as citizens can do is not to say, hey, you know, this stuff is completely harmless, it doesn't do anything bad and such, because there's no such thing on the earth actually that is completely harmless or completely good or completely bad. But let's move it to some sensible level of discussion, and let's begin by at least first changing the scheduling so that we can get this work done easier. Let's provide exemptions to people who are doing research, such that, for example, if my patient in San Diego brings me a product that they are taking, I can actually take that product and measure what's in it, measure what's the blood level of that person. I can't do that right now. It's all illegal. So there are a number of legislative steps that could be taken. There's also a banking act that is kind of trying to move its way forward, because another area of problem is, since it's a federally illegal thing, banks won't handle it, so businesses can't start and so forth. So there's several areas I think we can all talk to people about. I'm sorry, you're pushing me off the stage?
No, I think you can see we could go on and do this. Oh my gosh, Dr. Grant, what an enlightening this was tonight. This is one of our most exciting times, the February lecture series. This is our 20th year, actually. And when it comes to an end, I almost feel like crying. And tonight, I feel like celebrating. But I think about the Container Store, Melissa, and having you here tonight to celebrate this. Just Sunday night, Charles Lim, our first lecture, was on 60 Minutes. So watch it, make sure you see it. The sleep, I'm sure all of you are eating at a better time to get better sleep. Last week was on the BrainHealth Project. If you want your brain next year to be better than it is now, sign up. Particularly if you're between 20, we need 20 and 40-year-olds. So you want to make sure that you're part of this thing that's going to change the way we look at things as we live longer. Thank you all so much for being part of this, and help us make it next year. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And thank you, Dr. Brown.